In 3, 2, and 1. All right, and welcome back to the Reserve Squad Midweek Show, a soccer podcast covering all things in the EPL from a bench perspective. I'm your spin. This is a Week 8 review of the EPL, but I'm joined. I'm joined this time by a special guest from years yonder, I guess we could say. Jeremy, good to see you again.
Hey, great to see you. Sorry you can't see me. Long-time listener, definitely not a first-time caller, but I'm super happy to be here. Huge fan of the show and your work, Ben. So happy to be here and talk about the games.
Well, I mean, definitely with the main two that we're going to start off with, because you are a fan of Brentford, and Brentford were at least maybe the headline, I guess, of Saturday. Maybe not necessarily for the reasons you wanted,
Yeah,
but I definitely want to get your take, just kind of how the season has gone so far for them. I know you've been a little bit maybe pessimistic in some of the texts, so at the same time, they seem to be in a okay spot, though they are
yeah.
in a bit of a rough patch. But we'll get into that, and we'll probably spend most of the time talking about City and Arsenal, not necessarily the game because it wasn't necessarily that good, but kind of the implications of it, maybe why it wasn't necessarily that good. You've had some really good text to me, so I'd like you to maybe share your thoughts on that as well,
Nice.
and then that'll pretty much be it. I mean, we have it it is a week 8 review. I don't necessarily know how I'm gonna be able to do all of that, and then after that, there's a little bit of a break, and so I don't necessarily know if you wanna maybe get into, what the US is about to do with Germany and Ghana. Maybe not, but I'll probably kind of do a review of that next week since there is going to be, a bit of a break. So it's
Yeah,
it's a good time for maybe a break, for some of these
yeah.
clubs.
I like, and Ben, and we can play this however you like. I like, maybe we can discuss maybe some of the surprise teams of the year, and also I
Yeah.
want to maybe touch on Eden Hazard retiring. I think it's something you and I were talking about back and forth. So maybe a discussion point as well.
Well, let's start with that. Actually, that's a great way to lead off because I guess it was announced like maybe a day or two ago. I saw it trending on Twitter, and I was wondering, oh, why is he trending again now? And it is because of that. And there have been some. You showed me a video this morning. Joe Cole basically saying he's the best player I guess he's ever played with. And there's been a lot of discussion, I guess, online over the years on what really is his legacy. I mean, what are you? I guess we can maybe lead off with that. What do you think of when you think of Eden Hazard?
Yeah, it's really it kind of one of those things where when the news broke, I kind of thought, well, I thought he had already retired. You know, you almost sort of forget that he was still without a club after his Madrid contract expired. He's this is remarkable. He's only 32 years old. You know, you kind of think of him a little bit older than that.
It's
And
only
so
1 year
so
older.
most
1 year older than Salah. Wow.
only 1 year older than Salah. His prime was just so many years in the past. Yeah, I think everybody kind of has two perceptions of Eden. You know, you have the incredible years that he had at Chelsea, where Michael Cox actually had a really good article in the Athletic where he said that it might only be Thierry Henry and maybe Mohamed Salah, where this Eden Hazard was probably the player of the season for at least 3 years in the Premier League. He was
Wow.
clearly the best player. The years, I think, maybe 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016, somewhere around there. And then maybe his final season at Chelsea was pretty remarkable as well. And so, he's probably the best, or maybe the second best left winger that Premier League's ever had in terms of maybe Giggs being up there, Ronaldo, although probably just not a long enough time playing there. But I think in terms of him being at Chelsea, I just think of how fun he was to watch. He was just a dribbling machine. You had a great way of putting it. He was basically the Premier League's Messi, because I don't think we've ever seen anybody dribble like that in the Premier League in the way that he did, in the way that he used his body, some of the solo goals he has. He was definitely a scorer of great goals, a prolific goal scorer, than a great goal scorer, as they say.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably a little bit of his downfall, and probably why he's maybe not going to be remembered as fondly in the record books looking back. But anyway, that's kind of the Chelsea side. But the Real Madrid side is kind of the most. That's the other side you have to account for, and it's really disappointing because I think you and I kind of shared this, which is we thought that we didn't really think it was a good fit for him. Ronaldo had just left that summer. the style that Hazard played, he played on these counterattacking teams, really mazy dribbler. It's kind of something that I don't think Madrid was really crying out for. They needed to replace Ronaldo's goals,
And they also
and they
well
go ahead.
at the same time they also had was it James Rodriguez kind of at the same time.
Yes,
We kind of felt like that was kind of the same kind of player, and they were them replacing Ronaldo with Hazard didn't never really made sense at all, like you were saying. But it was also, I mean, Hazard was maybe off his best season, I think, for Chelsea at that time, and I don't know if it was the same time or not, but he was maybe Player of the World Cup in 2018.
yes, yes.
People maybe forget about that. I mean, uh, Belgium, I guess, I guess we're knocked out at France maybe in the semifinal. But the main reason was because of Courtois and Hazard, from what I remember.
Yeah, and the funny thing about is if you go back, he's a great highlight YouTube player. I think
Truly, yeah.
he's
Yep.
he's going to really live on in that way. He's just the way that the ball glued to his feet, the way he just glided and uses his body. I think of the goal he scored against Arsenal, where he basically took it from midfield, held off several challenges. Koscielny, I think a couple other defenders there, and then just slotted it in. And he actually had some really great performances at Madrid. He had some really great highlights.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think some of this, some
Maybe
of the Champions League performance.
when he was played at like a false nine, or
Yeah,
we thinking of that?
Yeah, and honestly, he had kind of a pretty good relationship, understanding with Benzema early on. I think the two of them, French speaking, they seem to actually enjoy playing with one another. Benzema played with Ronaldo, and that was kind of that was probably the first time where you saw Benzema got to be the lead man. I think he really enjoyed having somebody like Eden who was willing to, basically set him up for goals.
Facilitate, yeah.
But yeah, long story short, a little long-winded here, but basically he's just such a strange player because you just have this remarkable high in the Premier League and then really not even a low at Madrid. It's almost just it didn't happen, and that in itself just makes him a really confusing player to sum up.
Well, you talked about the video you showed me with Joe Cole.
Yeah.
He mentioned how the thing at the very end, how it's impossible to be compared to Messi and Ronaldo, not just because of the goals and everything that they were doing every single season. It was just the fitness. They were the way
Yeah.
they were able to just continue on, and apparently, his body eventually ended up kind of breaking down. I mean, the thing I think about Hazard is you kind of touched on it. It was just his ability to just take players on, and we really don't really see that in the EPL that often. Where someone that was truly a ball carrier that would probably complete, I don't know, 5 dribbles a game. I don't necessarily know what the stat would be, but it would seem like he would try to do that. It almost seems like players aren't allowed to do that. Managers don't want you to be individual and to possibly lose the ball by doing stuff like that. But he was just really good. And he's also, you mentioned he may be a YouTube player. I, when I think of him, I think of maybe the first time where I saw someone actually do a step over where it worked, not necessarily to get down the wing. Like Ronaldo was really good at step overs to kind of just, it would almost be like for show. Hazard was really good at because Messi would always kind of feint, and Messi would never do moves. Hazard to me was the
Yeah.
first player where I saw someone kind of dribbling in the middle of the field or whatever, in open or not necessarily in open space, in tight spaces, and where you saw kind of the step overs and kind of the moves worked. And you also mentioned a goal that came to your mind. The defining moment for me is the goal that won Leicester the title. I don't know if you
Oh,
remember that.
against Tottenham.
Against
The goal he
Tottenham.
scored against Tottenham.
Yeah.
Unbelievable goal. Yeah.
That to me is him just personified because of the way he collected the ball, made a man miss, and then had a shot from outside the box and just poured it into the net. And yeah, that's kind of the player I've been always kind of thinking about, and it is unfortunate because it just doesn't feel like you look at all these all this young talent that's coming up. You don't really see that kind of player profile.
I'm glad.
Coming through.
If I can cut it, I'm so glad you brought that up because I think that's kind of what I've been taking from some of the comments recently from ex players and some of the journalists is that he was also a really fun person. Like you'd see a lot of training videos of him. He always had that smirk on his head. It almost maybe kind of bled into that comment where Joe Cole says that maybe one of the reasons he didn't succeed is also he wasn't really a professional in the same way that at least Ronaldo was. He didn't have the extraterrestrial talent that I think Messi had. Where
like
maybe
Messi, then maybe.
Yeah, and I think, but he had a flair to him that I think is kind of missing. From today's game. And
especially
you
from
know, he
especially from a
go ahead.
European. I think that's worth kind of saying as well. Maybe.
Yeah. That's a great point.
Sorry.
No, you're fine. No, I think he's just. I think it's really watching him. It makes me a little bit nostalgic for what we don't really have right now in the Premier League, and I think that he's. The other thing I'll say about him is I remember the first time that actually he came on my radar was back when you were telling me that there was a player at Lille.
I knew him from
And
Blue. Yeah. Well, it was
yeah,
mostly from YouTube and I guess FIFA. Yeah. It was very weird how I knew of him before because I think we watched the Champions League final together. When Drogba, I guess, scored that goal to get to extra time, and basically it broke right after Chelsea had won that Hazard had decided to join the team that just won the Champions League, and I was like, no.
well, how much do you think that title? I mean, that was the season where Chelsea didn't finish in a Champions League spot. You know,
No,
they had
they weren't
fired.
good.
And I remember the following season. It was what Marco Marin came in. There was Oscar was there. It was actually a really fun Chelsea team that I think was in some ways a little bit ahead of its time.
Hmm.
It was a lot of small playmakers. The league, I don't think the league had really got. It was a team that I think maybe if you transport to right now is probably a little more like Tottenham, but just the style of football they were trying to play, but it just didn't really come off with what Di Matteo was doing. Probably wasn't as good of a manager as maybe someone like Pasacoglu, but it was a really fun team, and it was amazing that as good as he was then, it actually he played under these. You brought this up. He played under these really negative managers, and
Yeah.
he played and Mourinho. He obviously had the fallout there and all the different Conte, and the different managers. But he was always really successful with those type of managers. I guess in spite of them, and it makes you think if there's this alternate timeline, if he'd gone to somewhere like a Liverpool or a Man City, would he be even remembered even greater? And that's something that I think about too when I think about Hazard.
Yeah, it was funny because I was actually thinking about texting you. I was like, it sucked he had to play under Mourinho. If only he had gone to Manchester United, where he could have been given a Bruno role, and then immediately after Mourinho left Chelsea, he joined United. So so it was just kind of destined, I guess. But you kind of you mentioned how you maybe wanted to talk a little bit about some of the just how the season has gone so far. I did have a question like who is maybe your most surprised team of the season. I think we maybe agree, or maybe there maybe some contenders on here. So I mean, what would you who would you say has I guess surprised you either good or bad so far?
Well, we'll start with the good. It's definitely Spurs for me, and
Yeah.
I
Yep.
think part of that is because I was listening, maybe just like you, to a lot of TV, a lot of podcasts before the seasons, and one of the things that they said about Ange Postecoglou was, "It's going to take a while. It's going to take a while. Give him patience, please. Spurs, have patience."
Especially after
We
the
think
Brentford game, they were a mess.
they were a mess, and you think back to also Nuno sacking. You think, oh no, like is Spurs obviously a very different manager, a very negative manager, but you think is Spurs going to be willing to stick with a coach like this if things don't go right? How are the fans going to react? And what's been amazing about him? I'll talk about the football but I think the personality is he has really transformed that club. That was a club that really went through has been through like a really tumultuous time with Mourinho, with Conte, basically managers who just think they're so much bigger than Spurs. Conte, who basically put his finger on Spurs and said that this is a club that's cursed. This is a fan base that's just not deserving of any success. Really just horrific things you would say. You wouldn't even say about your ex-girlfriend. He was saying about
Jeez.
about the club. And what Postecoglou did, I think that what was most impressive is he came there and he seemed really, since the first I think manager since Pochettino, to actually sound like he really thought that Spurs was a big club. Like he was really excited to go to Spurs. And it wasn't like it was a club that was beneath him. It was a club that he thought that he could join them on a journey and raise them up. And he's such a personable guy. His press conferences, he's kind of he kind of cuts through. I think what we are used to with managers. He just comes off as somebody you would talk to in a pub or on the street.
Yeah.
There's probably a little bit of white male bias there to some degree, but Anglo-Saxon bias. But it is refreshing in some ways. And then what I think is most remarkable about Spurs is not only have they played really exciting attacking football against teams that are beneath them, but when they've come into these big matches against Liverpool, against Arsenal, where I thought Postecoglou would play reactive, would have to
Mm.
change his setup. He's basically gone full throated into that and said, "No, we're going to continue to play out of the back. We're
Right.
going to continue to play our football," and it's worked. And I've just been continuously waiting every week where they play a top 6 team, a top 8 team, and I'm just waiting for some kind of onslaught because of the way they play, and it's not happening.
Well,
And that to me is the most remarkable thing about them is just that kind of bravery. It's really it's almost like the anti Villas Boas if you remember back in it when he was at Spurs
oh
where
yeah.
Spurs and Chelsea where there was this really attacking football and it just never came off. You could see the offensive philosophy, but defensively it was just a mess. Here you're getting both, and I think that's really cool about him.
Yeah, I mean, it's just looking at how they went into the Arsenal game and Liverpool game, even before like the red card, it looked like it was going to be quite a good back and forth. And then you look at what they did last week, where it was an entirely different dynamic, where they were the ones that had to play down a man, and they still dominated. I mean, it is Luton Town, and I think we can agree that's probably the worst team in the league. But they still just completely dominated the play, and it seems like they've got a back line now that just they haven't necessarily had. Like it's the mix of him and their recruitment that has been really, especially starting with James Madison.
Mm-hmm.
And another thing you can say is Madison maybe at a different club wouldn't have been able to do what he's been allowed to do because of the way that it seems like Agni has given his play some freedom. We've seen that with the fullback, the way he uses fullbacks, Udogi
Yeah.
and Poro. They aren't necessarily just given a rigid role to just, oh, you only have to be on the wing. And when you also watch them play, it's not like they're necessarily lacking width either. So it is a pretty good mix. And you mentioned you actually, I think you were the first person that even showed me a clip of him, I guess, when he was a youth coach for Australia.
I'm glad you brought this up.
I think this was before it's even before like the season started. You were kind of saying, kind of keep your eye on this guy. And then I ended up kind of finding out he had a quote. I don't necessarily know if it was at Celtic or maybe he gave it at Spurs, but he basically talked about how he what made him being a fan first was going to a game and seeing a team kind of excite him, not necessarily a team setting up to just win,
Do you
essentially.
know? Do you know his favorite team? Do you know his favorite team is?
I think it is Liverpool, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's Liverpool.
I feel like I saw some kind of quote about that before last week. So yeah, I think especially they lost Harry Kane given the way they did. No one really
Yeah,
knew how this was going to work. And October break, they're I guess or they tied with Arsenal. They're leading the table at least. Maybe they have more goals scored. Uh, I was wondering if I put down Villa and West Ham. I mean, maybe for different reasons. Villa, I'm just kind of maybe hedging a little bit because I expected them to be, eighth, sixth ish, and they're like fifth. But given the way that Newcastle just completely thumped them with their high line, Liverpool didn't have issues with them either. Chelsea, I thought actually got the better of them, even though they lost that game with their high line. I kind of figured this would eventually be found out, especially them losing Tyron Mings the way they did. They don't have Emi Buendia. They've had to deal with some injury issues, and no, and not only that, Watkins looks a complete player, to be honest now. In fact, it's taken a while for him for the goals to come, but now the goals are coming. Uh, just the way he's got them, and you go back to when he joined, they probably it is kind of like a rise that Newcastle has had, where I guess maybe Deserby as well, where you see he's probably top four for points earned since he's arrived, and so maybe this shouldn't be a surprise, but I was just kind of expecting them to have a little bit of a bounce or a fallback, and then
good shout.
West Ham has truly stunned me though. You look at any kind of advanced stats or any kind of just stats when you look at possession, goals, xG, I guess xG that it should be against you. That I guess maybe they've had some good stops or whatever. It seems
Yeah,
like this isn't necessarily supposed to last. Though that said, they've been doing really well in Europe as well. So maybe Moyes has found a way. Plus, them losing Declan Rice, you didn't know how that was necessarily going to impact them. It looked like they were maybe going to lose Paqueta to that betting thing, which I'm pretty sure probably pissed you off, given what they were able to do with Tony. But Paqueta's been able to play, and he's been a star for them almost every single game week as well. So yeah,
I'm glad you shouted out West Ham because they're a team that I've seen quite a bit of just because of the time slots. And Paqueta and actually Thomas Suchek. What I think happened with them a little bit is they had this run last season in the conference league, and it's really easy to dismiss it. West Ham winning a trophy in a third-rate competition, but to the fan base and to Moyes, it was really emotional. I think it actually really energized this team, and I think it also I think what happened too is Moyes kind of figured out a little bit of a philosophy. There's always been this tension within Moyes' tactics and Moyes' style, which is he likes these very English style of counterattacking football. He likes his players to be really, all of his players, regardless of where they are in the team, to be very defensive.
Yeah.
It's almost a little bit negative in some degree, and a little bit hard to watch at times. And then there's been this tension because he's been at a club like West Ham, which has been well reported that they've got very modern, analytics-driven technical director trying to bring in some players like Mohamed Kudus, Edson Alvarez, Paqueta. And you were worried last season with Scamacca that there wasn't really going to be that integration. And it seemed like Moyes kind of won that battle by eventually Antonio playing, Bowen going back there, really getting his players back in the midfield that he wanted. And with the loss of, and so what I'm trying to say is I think that what's impressed me is that Moyes is actually taking some of these players that you really would have thought he would have brushed aside. Kudus scoring on the weekend. Looks like he's a player that the West Ham fans are just dying to have in the first team because he's scoring in the Conference League as well. So I've just been really impressed that he's been able to fit these players in. And the last point I was going to say about these two teams about Villa and West Ham is they have these really robust midfields. I'm looking at West Ham's game against Newcastle, and you got James Ward-Prowse, Souček, Alvarez, Paqueta, all packed in the midfield there. Yep. Villa does something similar where they play McGinn as well alongside those Luis and Kamara. Yeah, and I think they're just a really, really hard team to beat, and it's a style that I think is really benefiting them, just having at least four central midfielders, all of very different qualities in there. But yeah, very, very impressive this season, West Ham.
Yeah, and it's funny too because it seemed like there was kind of like a joke out there that it was going to be kind of easy to kind of clown them because Moyes was targeting McTominay, targeting Harry Maguire. And looking back, maybe he knew. Well, I don't necessarily know about Harry Maguire, but
McTominay,
maybe he knew something about McTominay. Well, I guess we can get to that later. I mean, what about maybe who has disappointed you, or maybe you just I guess surprised for the opposite reason?
Yeah, I wrote down two here. First, it's United. I think that there was. I think you and I probably share that the summer signings maybe weren't as good as advertised. And I do think there has been some performances that probably should have deserved at least a point or 3 points. But what's really concerned me is the fact that there doesn't really seem to be a lot of growth in this team. There was a period last winter, early in January, where the team went on a really good run. Obviously they won the cup final.
They didn't lose at Old Trafford last season.
They didn't lose at Old Trafford last season
after losing to the first game to Brighton. I'm pretty sure.
And and obviously with United, you caveat so many things with the injuries, with the new players, with the fact that it's a club that really is going through a transition, a multi-year transition.
Yeah.
But I just was expecting some level of growth, some level of performance, and it seems like they've almost taken a step backwards. They really have been outplayed by some teams. Burnley, for example, got a point there, but and you saw that a little bit last season. But you still thought that this would be a season where they really kick on. Right now, they're sitting in 10th place at 12 points. Really, even lucky to get to get not only a point but 3 points against Brentford. I would come on to that. And then the other team, I think you kind of called this out as well, and I do want to touch base on this. Is I've been really disappointed in Arsenal, even though they're sitting there at the top of the table. I thought that they were pound for pound alongside Brighton last season, just the best watch. And, they've had their injury problems too, but I don't think the signings have worked out so far for them. I think they're a bit fortunate to be as where they are at the top of the table. And I really have wondered, just kind of like United, if they're not actually really growing in the way that they should be. That was part of the reason why I went out to get Rice and Raya was, I think Arteta really thought that he had sort of a complete team and just needed a few more pieces to move them to the next level. And for me, what I'm seeing is something kind of the opposite. Is almost like they're kind of creating holes that they didn't really have before. It's just a little bit concerning to me. But again, you can only say it's only disappointing in the sense that I just was expecting a different quality of football.
Yeah.
But those are the two that stick out to me. There's probably a few more, but I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Well, I was thinking just because of all the money that Chelsea has spent, and I don't know. I feel like both United and Chelsea were I think that talk sport or I think there would have been an interesting conversation for the international break had both United and Chelsea lost their games. But just kind of given how the way they started, though, I kind of do think Chelsea is about to bounce back, to be honest, because the way Moses Caicedo is starting to work for them, it completely with him actually being in form and being the player that he was at Brighton. You look at the way that balance with Gallagher and Enzo, all of a sudden that midfield is looking really good for the last couple of games, and
Yeah,
Sterling's now finally scoring for them. They've been losing for goals, but for the entire
Cole Palmer had a
Cole
fantastic
Palmer's been
performance
a
the weekend.
really good addition as
Yeah,
well. Yeah. And you kind of all of a sudden you kind of look at them and maybe they get Reece James back. You look at them as maybe they could go on a little bit of a run. They have a hell of a schedule though coming up. They have like what is it? It's Arsenal, City, Tottenham, Newcastle, Brighton. It's kind of all of them all in a row. So they have a chance to like make up a lot of ground or completely lose it entirely. But I don't know, I kind of had a I was a little bit surprised with the way Newcastle has started the season. I was really high on them. And they're not necessarily far away. Given the way
yeah,
that they looked versus PSG, you're like, where's this Newcastle been? I think they've been missing Longstaff. I think inserting him back into the 11 has helped them a little bit. But it's also been, has Newcastle been kind of fool's gold? You look at the signings that they brought in, Harry Wilson or Harvey Barnes, and you just kind of look at who Villa brought in with Musa Diaby. Kudus was available. And that hasn't necessarily worked out, though Gordon has started to work out a little bit better for them. But I don't know. I was a bit expecting Newcastle to continue the kind of form that they were in last season to maybe see if that would be a bump. And it seems like they maybe kind of stalled, not necessarily regressed, but maybe stalled. Also, Champions League, I need to kind of factor that in, how that's going to be different. I think with Brighton, that can be kind of sad as well. The way that Brighton started the season, you were like, oh, they're not going to miss Alexis and Casado, and I think they actually are for the last couple of games. And then I had a special shout out, just kind of calling out VAR and Howard Webb. It just seems that has not necessarily improved, and in some cases gotten worse. Not to sound like a sore loser from last week, or actually even this week, how the Kovacic red was discussed and I guess defended. That didn't make sense to me at all either. And then let's see. This is kind of I guess loaded, but how do you maybe expect the table to look at Christmas time? Do you think it'll be kind of what we're at, or do you think there'll be maybe a surprise?
yeah. I saw you put this down here. It made me want to go through some of the standings. There always is a surprise at Christmas and in the top four, top two. I remember a couple seasons back, it wasn't quite Christmas, but Southampton were I think in the top four until at least late November, and then they pretty much crashed
during the COVID bubble, right? With the
they pretty much crashed down to
That's right.
To almost near relegation, but saved themselves just from that early season form. Yeah, I'm like you. I'm still buying the Tottenham hype. I look at some of their schedule. I think they're going to be all right. I think them only playing once a week is really helping
100%.
out things here.
Yep.
Obviously, more time in the training pitch. I was listening to a podcast the other day about one thing I was going to mention. Actually, this is just aside, but it's related to this is. I think one of the disappointments has just been the number of injuries that's happened this season, and I think the number of players that are just having increasing load.
Well,
Kevin De Bruyne,
I don't think
Saka.
right. I don't think that's at all surprising, to be honest. I was kind of expecting that
agree.
last season, and you look at the way that they've done COVID for the last 2 or 3 seasons, the way that they had to do the World Cup. I was expecting it to happen last season, and I think it's finally showing up now. I saw that there's something like 100 players out for muscle injuries right now, overplay or something else. But there's definitely something happening.
Well, I think also, and not to go backwards to that conversation, but I do think that I've been disappointed also in some of these managers that are not using the 5 subs since I've come on board. Guardiola probably being the best example, but other managers as well. Arteta, sometimes you don't even see that with certain with the certain managers lower down the league as well, where you think just you need to start playing some of your bench players and just making sure you conserve those minutes. But going back, I think that Tottenham having only playing once a week, more training time with a new coach, that's only going to benefit them. I really think that this is going to at least sustain till Christmas.
Saves Madison's legs too.
Takes Madison's legs. You know, I'm I'm wondering also, looking at the table right now, you have Tottenham, Arsenal tied for first, Man City, and Liverpool. I do think I'm kind of buying that City's going to have another one of those dip in forms, at least until the spring. That just seems to be sort of the recipe for Guardiola over the last several seasons.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, we're starting to see just how much Kevin De Bruyne is missing. We're going to come on to that in a bit. How much Gundogan's missing. I also think they just didn't really have a good summer in terms of spending. I think Doku's been really exciting, but in terms of just ready-made players that they needed for their squad, I don't know if Kovacic and Nunes are just up to the quality. And also Kovacic is probably his age is getting up there. So I'm kind of thinking that in terms of the top four, it's going to stay Tottenham, Arsenal. I think you might start to see Liverpool even crop up there just a little bit, but we're going to see how much the load is going to matter from their Europa League performances. And then the other team I want to shout out here is I do kind of am buying Newcastle kind of regaining their form. I do think if you look at the recent performances, they did have that loss to Brighton. They did have that unfortunate loss to Liverpool, which should have been a win. But they are consistently performing at home. They're consistently scoring at home. They have a lot of depth that they didn't have last season. And Hal has actually been pretty good just about using his subs. I do think that we could probably see them climb back into the top 5, top 6, maybe top 4.
Yeah.
So that's probably the ones that I look out for is Tottenham, Arsenal, Newcastle, and obviously Man City up there as well.
Yeah, I mean Chelsea keeps kind of going into my head
that's a good one.
When you just look at almost every single game, except I guess like the most recent one, I guess comes to mind. But they've been up there when it comes to just having the ball, and that to me is kind of. I don't know. I've kind of become one of those
brutal schedule though. Very very brutal schedule.
It is a brutal schedule, but it does.
Tottenham, Man City, Newcastle,
yeah,
Brighton, United in a 6-game span. Yeah,
it also gives them a chance to guys catch up. I guess you can maybe think of it that way. I don't know. I just think that in every single one of those games, I think Chelsea's maybe going to have the better midfield. And we don't necessarily know when Lavia is going to return. I think getting Reece James back, I guess, will help them out as well. I don't know. I would like that not necessarily to be the case because they beat Liverpool to Caicedo and Lavia, and they spent all this money, and I would like them to actually suffer a little bit for that. But I'm starting to actually the last couple of weeks that midfield has started to show up a little bit, and I'm kind of with you. The only thing I was thinking of is maybe Spurs can actually be can not only continue this, maybe they can stay above Arsenal. At least at Christmas time, maybe Arsenal will eventually figure things out. I do think their issues are pretty fixable, because their issues really are just trying to find a way to get Havertz going or finding a way to maybe keep the load off Saka. I think you're starting to maybe see that. How do you kind of find that right balance in the forward line? Because it seems Nketiah is starting to be struggle a little bit for service. When do you insert Jesus? That's kind of been and just kind of the midfield inserting Rice into that. I think has kind of made them worse in possession, but better out of possession, if that makes sense. I just feel like Party coming on kind of won them the game because of the ball that he sent. I don't think Declan Rice plays that kind of ball for the goal that they had. So.
Ben, one more shout I want to have, and I think this is probably a team you weren't even expecting me to say, but I was looking at the XG standings this week. We mentioned how West Ham was overperforming, but a team that I keep it's actually Everton.
Oh, interesting.
Is they lost a really unfortunate game to Luton, but besides that, they lost by a goal to Arsenal. They beat Brentford. They beat Villa in the cup. They smashed Bournemouth at the weekend. And they actually are starting to play pretty good football. They're out shooting a lot of teams. Their attack has actually been pretty decent this season in terms of expected goals.
They got Calvert Lewin back for the last couple of games. I think that's helped them. And just kind of cutting in. I remember talking about them after their Villa game when Villa just completely was it Villa and Brighton. Someone just completely went over the top of them pressing and was having fun when they were playing Michael Keane in the back line. And since then, Braithwaite has come in, and that little partnership with him and Tarkowski has been a lot better to me. Also, since Mikolenko has come in, Ashley Young is on the right back side, uh, and so I think that's maybe helped them out a little bit because I was kind of expecting them to really struggle. And you're right, they look really good for Brentford. And then they've kind of kept up that form. And you're right, the last couple of games, I think they've averaged 20 plus shots. You're right about that.
Well, they've got this guy Beto is really physically he's really perfect for the Premier League and really able to play that style of football that Moyes wasn't able to get out of Maupay. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. That's it's very concerning to me is that they're a team that's right now obviously flirting with that relegation spot and they're probably going to be okay, which is not good for Brentford. But they're I could see them making a little bit of a run before for Christmas, yeah.
Well, they start. Hopefully, that run happens after the break because they open up with Liverpool.
Liverpool.
I'm pretty sure it's the early game too, where Klopp like famously hates those early like Saturday morning kickoffs. Um,
Oh,
so,
brutal.
so yeah, and to speak of Everton, like one of the players I mentioned, Calvert Lewin, but Doucouré has maybe been a player of the week for the last couple of weeks, just for everyone. He's been flying for them. I was kind of wondering if maybe Burnley kind of figured this out. They seem a mess at the back. That's the only thing, and I don't necessarily know how you can necessarily fix that with better, unless you're playing different personnel. But B- Burnley's like the one like kind of promoted team that to me I feel like is close to getting things right. They
Yeah.
it seems like getting Val Foster back from the red card. It seems like their attack at least is firing a little bit better, and just the way that they pretty much dominated United, to be honest. And the way that they lost that game was kind of I thought a little bit unfair. But I don't feel like they're necessarily far away from at least kind of finding a gap to where they're somewhat safe. So maybe that happens.
That's a good shout. Yeah, that's a good shout. I've been impressed with them. I think I've been impressed at least week by week, and I think Luton is starting to figure out the league a little bit. And I think it's gonna it's definitely not going to be Sheffield United out of those three teams, but yeah, I think Burnley at some point I think Company's going to get it right. They probably still need to dip into the transfer market in January because I think they still need a goal scorer. They just don't have. It's just not. They're not finding it as easy as they did in the championship, obviously.
Yeah, but I just like the way that they're at least able to somewhat keep the ball and somewhat
Yeah.
try. They do try to like actually pass through teams. Luton Town seem to have they average like 150 passes a game, if that, 50%.
Like that.
Which is wild. And I guess maybe one thing that I don't think is necessarily that I guess that big a prediction, but it seems like maybe the first manager to go might be Bournemouth's.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
it really feels like Areola isn't necessarily we're working out, and you just kind of look at the squad. I don't really know. They got unlucky because they brought in Tyler Adams, and I was really excited about this because I kind of looked at who was in their midfield, and I was like, oh, there's really no one. Alex Scott is injured, and now Tyler Adams looks like he's going to be injured till like December. And you look at that midfield's probably the worst in the league, other than maybe Luton Town. And it doesn't really because it seems like their attack is fine. Their defense seems to be okay, but they're letting in a lot of goals. For that, and it seems like they're really front loaded in a way that they maybe shouldn't be. And they like high pressing. They like trying to take teams on. But it feels like every game I see them, they fall short in the second half, and it's happening every single game week. And I don't necessarily know if they're going to be game to just kind of stick with him. So
That's a good shot. And one thing I was going to mention is after the break, talking about Everton playing Liverpool would be an exciting game. Bournemouth play Wolves, so that's the Gary O'Neill derby.
you're right.
So,
Yeah.
you could see the fan base, who I think is already starting to turn on Areola, which and they were probably one of the more excited fan bases going into the season. They're if Wolves wins that game, and Wolves are actually playing pretty well, I think that's going to put a lot of pressure on the owner there.
Yeah, they sold Jefferson Lerma to Crystal Palace, and I don't really understand why. I feel like that's been kind of a sneaky mistake. Now Lerma's been
Yeah.
been injured for Palace, but they don't have anyone. And then kind of like last, not, so I'm going to change this up. We'll just kind of do an episode, just kind of just talking with you. I'll do kind of a rundown later because I don't want to be like a 4 hour episode. What would you do if you were like Brentford's owner with Ivan Toney? I kind of want to get that out.
I go back and forth on this. I think let me just start up by saying that it does kind of seem, at least from the comments that he's made recently in interviews, that he's going on sort of a campaign of sort of selling himself to some of these bigger clubs.
I think so.
Uh,
Yeah.
he, humorously, there's always been this back and forth. Brentford, who first game in the Premier League played Arsenal, Ivan Toney gave some a funny little tweet, which I think got a little bit too much mileage than it deserved, where he was poking fun of Arsenal after the game, and then Arteta used that famously to motivate his team for future matches.
Oh yeah,
Well,
that was in the Amazon documentary.
yeah, and I always found that kind of comical because I don't even think what Ivan Toney said, which was for our listeners, is he just said had a good kickabout with the boys. I don't even think it was really. I don't even think it was really much more than just having a good time. Really, nothing serious there. And I think Arteta, who is kind of a master manipulator
Yeah.
with it when it comes to motivational speeches, was just milking everything he could out of that. That being said, he's come out since then and said very nice things about Arsenal, about being a fan when he was a young boy.
Yeah.
He said nice things about Liverpool. He said nice things about Tottenham. He's clearly thinking, and probably rightfully so, in terms of a player who's probably worried about the fact that this has really derailed his trajectory, his financial growth, his earnings. We have to be concerned about that as well for players that they're thinking about that for the rest of their lives, is how they're going to actually live out their lives, because their playing career is so short. So completely apathetic there. That being said, he has a contract until 2025. Brentford are just kind of struggling right now, and I think they've tried to go for some strikers in the summer. They've tried Jan Wissa. I was a big fan of that. It's maybe not coming off as good as I thought.
Mm-hmm.
Eating my words there. Although I still think there's a good player there, and I think that he may be kind of what this team needs, a little bit of a lift in January, if that is still the case, that Brentford are struggling. And I think they might be. We can come on to it a bit, but I think they might be, just because the injuries are piling up, and it's feeling a little bit like the season that they first came up in 2021. So I would say that obviously sell high if you can. I still think that he's going to be incredibly in demand in the summer, just because he's an English striker.
Yeah.
He's got a cap. But I do think that he's kind of a player they need right now, and they probably can't find so easily in the transfer market. So I would say keep him.
He also needs to think that if he does kind of have a really good, second half of the half of the season, I mean, Euros are coming up, and I don't know if
That's true.
changing to a different club, maybe different physios. It takes a little while to kind of get used to everyone. Maybe he maybe that wouldn't necessarily go as well, at least in the beginning. But yeah, you mentioned a couple. I think Chelsea could be another. I guess all three in London. Chelsea, Spurs, and Arsenal feel like they would fit. Going after him, it feels like.
Yeah.
But I thought his contract did end in the summer, so that's good that at least it's 2025. And one thing I kind of was going on with you about is I thought it was insane for them to give away David Raya the way that they
Yeah.
did. But apparently, the loan deal apparently is not only it is obligation to buy, not just the option to buy.
Yeah, that's right.
Because I feel like that is kind of put them in a little bit of a zone. And I used to be kind of pretty calm with where Brentford are at, and they are in a bit of a rough patch. Someone like Tony would immediately, because they go long all the time. They don't seem to be able to kind of play through teams, and he's like the best in the air when it comes to just winning duels and being physical. And it just feels like that Brentford versus Everton game that really showed up, where they just don't have that anymore. And
Yes.
especially like the way that they could just they could get a scoring chance from a goal kick by just kind of doing a ball to Tony and then kind of heading it over to like Bremer making a run. Just something simple like that. But also his like work rate was like amazing. I remember him kind of being an amazing kind of defender all the way back. So I do think I like that idea of actually sticking with him. And maybe someone can get in his ear that you stick with Brentford. And a team that you already know, and have an amazing second half of the season. Your Southgate will call you, and then there will always be clubs looking to call you after the summer. Now, again, you can't get injured, but uh, I don't know. But anyways, I do want to get your takes on Arsenal and City
Yeah.
and the Brentford game. I don't necessarily know how we're doing for time. Uh, the
We're fine.
Arsenal
We're fine. I got about 20 minutes left.
the
Yeah.
Arsenal City game, our Martinelli gets the goal. I mean, leading off, it was these were the 2 games that kinda did decide, the title, last season. I think Arsenal had a 5-point gap. City always had the games in hand, if you remember. But Arsenal had a 5-point gap going into that game at the Emirates. Arsenal actually outplayed Man City that game. It's crazy to say because they lost, like, 3-1, but it was, like, the lowest possession I think Arteta has had. Like, it wasn't it wasn't like this. But, Tommy also played that game, and he had a hard mistake, and Kevin De Bruyne kind of got, like, an early goal, and then they couldn't handle Holland. And then the game at the Emirates, basically, they couldn't handle Holland either, or Kevin De Bruyne, and they went into that game without Saliba, and so Saliba was fit this time. Gabriel Jesus was fit this time. And it was also coming off the back of the Community Shield win. I think everyone kind of forgot about that. I guess no one really cares about that because I listening to all the comments. So can Arsenal finally get one over City? It's been like XX years or whatever. Man City always beats Arsenal, and I was like, they've already beat them this year. So and then Kevin De Bruyne's role in the games last season, I think that ended up kind of showing up. And the thing that was funny is this game really was boring, and you called it El Napico. And I was disagreeing in the pregame, and you predicted it why, and so I guess I'll ask, why did you think it was going to be that case?
Yeah, yeah. That I let me just start off with a little bit of a prelude, which is that I started off Sunday morning watching Brighton and Liverpool,
Mhm.
and it was one of the most enjoyable games I'd seen all season. And I think in general throughout the Premier League, it's been a really quality product. We've had our injury concerns, and obviously a lot of these teams are playing in Europe, but I think the overall quality of the league and the kind of football that we're seeing is really great. The exception to that rule is both these teams. I have been really unimpressed with what I've seen with Arsenal, as I mentioned earlier. Even at the fact that they are still winning, I still think that if you ask me to watch Arsenal or Tottenham every week, I'd choose Tottenham in a heartbeat.
Yeah.
And the same goes for Man City. I think ever since Guardiola has figured out this alternate formation, these these four center backs, he's basically told anybody playing at fullback, whether it's center back or a fullback, to just not go forward.
Yeah.
Same goes for Arsenal, stuck inside. I just think the football has been really bad. And what's only ever changed that equation is they play a team like Real Madrid on a Champions League night, and that's been a stunning performance. Or Kevin De Bruyne has been in the lineup, and he changes the way City's plays. And neither of those were going to happen the other night. And the other reason why I really thought that this was going to be a bad quality game is I think Arteta has learned the lesson against Man City. I think he's basically learned that he can't go gung ho against them. He's learned these in the big games. He's learned to basically tell his midfielders and his fullbacks where they should be. What he's essentially told them is rest defense, which is basically just do not get countered against, do choose very high percentage passing.
Yeah.
And it makes for just a very, very dull watch. And I think something you're going to come on to is the fact that you just see very little adventurous play by either of these teams. There's not a lot of individualism. There's not a lot of risk taking, and it just felt like a game that was due for that. And then the other thing I'll add on top of that is I do think that these games sometimes suffer a little bit because Erling Haaland just hasn't shown up, I think, in a big game in a while. And I think one of the things that makes City really exciting is when Erling Haaland shows up at this point. And we had no Rodri. We had no Erling Haaland showing up. We had all these other players having to shuffle positions, like Bernardo Silva, who's probably the next most exciting player with Kevin De Bruyne out, having to play further back, so you lose that adventurousness. You got Benjamin Doku on the wing. So I just think all that said is it just for me spelled out a very, very dull game. And I think the XG of the game for both teams was under 1. Really, it really should have been a deserving win by anybody. Maybe Arteta deserves it for being a little bit adventurous, but it was just a really bad watch.
I mean, because looking back, it makes sense because the Community Shield was exactly kind of the same thing. I remember kind of, we were texting back and forth even during it, and we basically hit the same themes from both the Community Shield game and this game, where it seemed like all the excitement or all the action was when a team was on goal kicks or when the keeper had the ball because you were wondering, well, how is a team going to necessarily either force them into a mistake or is the team going to necessarily press? not never press. Is a team going to, with the ball? Are they going to, find the passing patterns to yes, get through a couple of those lines? And neither team. You mentioned risk taking. Neither team wanted to take a risk. In fact,
Yeah.
the only risk in the first half was Kovacic going to ground trying to win the ball back, and he could have gotten sent off.
Single-handedly wanted to lose the game. Yeah, that was just quickly on that bet. That was remarkable to me. Was a player who the first tackle should have been red. Both tackles should have been a red card in themselves, not even that they're cumulative. The fact that neither of them accumulated to a red card was remarkable because it was just stupidity by him. It almost seemed like he single-handedly wanted to make the game exciting.
they just didn't. I think that was it. I think he was just tired of Arsenal just kind of just passing the ball backwards and sideways. I think the main difference with them is Declan Rice is playing instead of Partey. To be honest, and then Partey ended up having that weird stretch last season. I think it coincided with Saliba being out. Even though Saliba's not necessarily the best ball either, but all of a sudden teams started pressing Partey, and Partey started making some mistakes last season. But it just feels like they can't pass the ball through the middle. Just they go out wide, and then in this game there were no outlets on either team to actually get a ball over the top or get the ball in the wing where someone can actually beat someone 1v1. And it seemed like the way that both teams set up was also almost to go like man for man. And that kind of showed up a little bit. And, Foden and Alvarez aren't really wingers. They want to play inside. So that made it kind of easy for, I thought, the two fullbacks. I thought it was crazy how they didn't have Doku starting. I thought that was kind of a theme as well. And then with Arsenal, Trossard kind of wants to do the same thing that maybe Alvarez or Foden wants to do. He's not going to want to get the ball out in the wing. And I think it was kind of funny how the way the game kind of ended up winning for Arsenal was Martinelli came on, and on the game winning goal, the Martinelli's position is actually starting position is on the touchline, and Kyle Walker sees that, and Kyle Walker kind of shifts over, and that creates a little gap between Kyle Walker and Ruben Diaz. And that's where Tomiyasu decides to actually make a run. Foden, he's allowing Foden to get, I guess, in front of him, but Foden's allowing Tomiyasu to be goal side of him. And Tomiyasu makes that run. Partey sees it, and that's kind of where the goal comes from. It was funny how neither team was in the beginning was trying to stretch the pitch out. Everything was very, very congested, and you mentioned not having Kevin De Bruyne. That definitely showed because Kevin De Bruyne would take a chance. Kevin De Bruyne would try to find Haaland making a run in behind. I thought Haaland was actually making somewhat good runs, but the difference this time than last time is Saliba was able to go 1v1 with him in a way that we haven't necessarily seen before. And another thing that I was a bit surprised with is you mentioned maybe Arteta had figured City out. And at the Emirates, they did try to high press. They did try to get Ederson to hoof the ball away. I remember there was a time when Granit Xhaka got caught, and that was when they went over the top to Haaland. Haaland wasn't, Holden was sitting off him, and then Haaland kind of played a couple 1-2s with Kevin De Bruyne, and that's how they were able to kind of get behind him. In this game, Arsenal weren't necessarily pressing high, but they were playing almost a high block. They were marking high. And so when City had the ball, you saw this a lot. They didn't necessarily care when Ederson had it. You can obviously do this when you don't have the opening goal. They didn't care when Ederson had it, and they almost didn't care when Kyle Walker or Gvardiol had the ball. And everything was trying to get them to get City to pass it to them out on the wings, and then you would try to shift over and try to close them down there, also using the sideline as almost like a defender. And neither Kyle Walker or Gvardiol were able to actually pass through that, or they didn't have any kind of options for them either. I thought that was a telling point. And the reason why I kind of bring this up is when you saw Arsenal, the way Arsenal went after Tottenham, you didn't see that. You saw them high pressing like crazy, and it basically their best moments came when they got Spurs to kind of turn it over into a couple of mistakes. There was a Jesus chance that came from doing that, and I think Nketiah had a chance kind of doing that. That was actually basically Arsenal's best moments in the Spurs game. I guess in open play.
Sure.
So I was kind of expecting, Arteta was going to do the same thing he did for Spurs, and he didn't. So I was a little bit surprised about that.
Yeah, that's well said. I think it's a shame we didn't get. You're right. Arsenal is capable of doing this at home. They're capable of pressing high. I think there's a little bit of a master and apprentice thing here where I think Arteta didn't want to get into that sort of a contest like he had before where City were able to quickly pass out of the back. And it's a shame. It's a shame we didn't get that because both these teams can play really good football. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just I mean, one note I did have, and I guess I'll kind of read it off because I'm not really good at just kind of talking off the
Are
top
you
of my
fine?
head.
You're fine.
But the way the game is shifting now, especially with these kind of elite teams, the note I had, I guess I kind of texted it to you, was it used to be keepers good with the ball at their feet. That made a team more exciting. You're like, oh,
Yeah.
this is progressive. And instead, when teams aren't necessarily pressing the keeper or no longer kind of marking the center backs, standing out wide, but marking everyone else, you're lost for options. And if a team doesn't necessarily want to go long and risk losing the ball, you're seeing a lot of really boring possessions being recycled where nothing is happening over and over again. And maybe
I'm glad you. I'm glad you kind of. I'm glad you brought this up. It's something that I couldn't put my finger on when you brought this up. I think it's so true because I think what's also changed, and this is something we've discussed, is I think it's Roberto De Zerbi as well. I think what's happened is so many teams now have understood is that some of these possession teams have understood that the purpose of possession is not simply to just move the ball across the pitch to get to the final third. It's where's your opponent in relation to that.
Mhm.
And what these managers have decided is if my keeper can have the ball and my keeper can comfortably have the ball and they're not being pressed, then they're just going to walk the ball up. There's no what Guardiola used to do with his keepers is the second his keeper had the ball, he quickly transitioned it out wide to an open man. But that serves nothing if you're not manipulating the team without the ball. You're just creating a situation that's probably not advantageous because the opposition is set up in a defensive shape and really if David Raya passes the ball to Ben White and there's Phil Foden on him, what's the point? But what these managers are starting to do is they're actually passing the ball back to the keeper, and it's just dying there. It's just the keepers. In fact, I think it's a statistic I'd love to look at is how much the keepers are actually just possessing the ball and casually rolling the ball out of the back. And
Yeah.
you're right. It's not making for at least, and it's not at least from my perspective, it's not making for very interesting football at times because I think the other team knows that this is what's happening. They're not pressing the opposition. They don't want to open themselves up to those spaces, those half spaces. And I saw that a lot this game, especially with Ederson. I think Arsenal chose selectively not to press Ederson. You saw a lot of Ederson just putting the sole on the foot. I see the sole on the ball, and it just was a shame. I think it's a little bit of that as well.
And it was just because Arsenal have gotten burned, I guess, like pressing Ederson in the past, and it almost feels like teams have figured out. You kind of mentioned it how when teams are kind of playing from the back a little bit, it almost is a little bit of a diversion to get you to draw out, and then that does create a little space in behind. But another thing too is just City. I guess Arsenal kind of had the same issue. Is there weren't really outlets to go long and necessarily hurt a team necessarily doing that, and I guess when things are really cluttered, you need to have someone beat someone 1v1 essentially. It seemed like both teams were doing man for man, and neither team seemed capable of doing that. And I do think it's actually is fitting that Arsenal won because the game was crying out for width, and so he brought on Martinelli, and basically, Tommy also took a chance. Thomas Partey took a chance. Finally, someone took a risk, and
Yes,
it was finally rewarded.
I'm glad you brought that because his Martinelli. This is one stat I wanted to get in, which is Martinelli 5 shots in the game. Arsenal had 12. He had more shots than anybody else on the pitch.
Yeah.
Came on at halftime. He was the one. I think you and I are maybe not so quietly big fans of Martinelli. I think he's sort of discounted as sort of a great player because he's a player that I think going back to our Hazard comments, he's a player that really does try to do really exciting things on the pitch and not just for show. He's also I think in that game where City didn't have a player of his quality of that kind of adventurousness. Martinelli was somebody. And Saka obviously on the pitch as well. Martinelli was a player that really was capable of changing the game on his own. Where I think Holland basically is requiring service, that kind of thing. So yeah, I'm glad that he got the winning goal, and I'm also glad that Havertz was involved as well because he's had a tough time.
Yeah, well, Havertz's like starting position is actually right with the center backs, and you finally see Jesus actually doing a good job to hold with on that moment as well. It seemed like I tried to maybe I don't know directed them to do it, but it was like the one time when the pitch actually was somewhat it forced City to actually mark the entire length of it, and finally they were rewarded. Um, I mean, this that kinda did shock me, though. City were 1 for 10 crossing the ball with Man City, and, like, I think the best chance that they had, at least in the first half, maybe in the whole game, was, like, the
Yeah,
one time when Gvardiol actually did make an overlap run, at from Foden. Foden played him in, and it was a decent cross in, and, I think actually Gabriel ended up kind of, just kinda heading it away at the last second. But it's just shocking how they honestly weren't really looking for him. And I think another, moment I had was maybe Man City's best chance in the second half, when it seemed like they actually did have Arsenal in a bit of a trouble, situation, is, when Foden got the ball, I guess, from a I forget who passed it. It might have been Gvardiol, it might have been Doku, but someone it might have been Alvarez. Alvarez passed Foden the ball, I don't know if you remember this, into the box, and Foden actually has a bad touch, and basically Rice is able to kind of knock it away at the end. But the reason why Foden had a little of that space was when Holland was actually out wide and kind of forced Saliba to kind of go with him away, and it was like the one time when I guess, the one time when you saw Arsenal having to deal with someone in the box that wasn't Holland. It made it harder for them. And you've kind of mentioned how you were wondering if maybe it isn't necessarily the best to play Holland over say an Alvarez in that position, at least with Kevin De Bruyne being out. And I think that was like the one moment you kind of saw there might be something to that theory.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. No, this City won the title last season, the treble last season with Holland, and it would be poor of me to say that he was not obviously with record goal scoring he had in the league, but City did score less goals last season with Holland, and they did in the year before and the year before that. They
that is
they
interesting.
all they also, what I mentioned earlier is typically in a lot of these big games, it's Holland. We're talking about diversion. Holland typically really is a diversion, and
Yeah,
there is probably something to be said for the fact that he's occupying both center backs, which allow for goals. But City have also got a lot of goals from Rodri. City have also got, who is also missing in this game. City have also got a lot of goals for their center backs.
well, I think
And
yeah.
go ahead.
Oh, no, just we haven't necessarily gone into that. So 3 games they were without Rodri. 3
No
games they
wins.
lost. Right.
Yeah.
And another thing too is I'm trying to think if Rodri plays, maybe I don't know. I don't think it's Rico Lewis, but I think that you maybe play Bernardo Silva on the wing, and he actually does a decent job of staying on. He's not necessarily going to beat anyone 1v1, but maybe that forces Zinchenko to mark him because the way that they were playing Alvarez, it was kind of easy for Zinchenko to play in midfield and also kind of defend in the half space. And City were just, or it like Doku. I don't know. They needed to find a way to kind of just stretch the pitch out. And I feel like had Rodri been in, maybe Pep would have done something different. So you see that. So it didn't just hurt them, I guess, defensively. Definitely in possession. I feel like that factored in a lot. I don't remember the last time Pep actually just straight out went with a 4-3-3. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that was they basically, both teams matched up against each other, and that's why it was so cagey and not necessarily, that enjoyable. I also we kinda mentioned it as well, but, Saliba being back really was everything, the way that they were able to they weren't necessarily pressing high, but they were, positioned high, Arsenal were. And there was actually a lot of space for Holland to try to make a run in behind. And anytime that happened, Saliba actually was 1v1 and was able to man up against them in a way that, someone like Holden would have probably laid off. And I think maybe Pep was a little bit surprised about that. I think Saliba back really was maybe the MVP of this game. So
Yeah.
that's worth
Agreed.
kind of saying it as well. Um,
Mhm.
and so I guess that's kind of it. I mean, you mentioned how you kind of you can still see Arsenal maybe being in first place. It does feel like their issues aren't necessarily as big as it seems like their issues are maybe more fixable than not. But it does at the same time they how if Saka being in this game, how do you think that changes anything? I don't necessarily think it does, and I feel like they still have some issues with their front line, and I don't know how Thomas Partey gets back into the squad with Rice. Um, I guess maybe you play. Can you do all 3 with Odegaard? It almost seemed like Arteta understood you can't play Rice as the lone pivot,
Yeah.
in a game like this. It almost seemed like that's the reason why he went with Jorginho. I thought that was kind of interesting, and that's maybe worth, saying that as well. Arteta did a good job actually doing that, because playing Declan Rice higher up the pitch, the reason why, City didn't weren't able to do anything. I guess in their buildup is Rice and Keta were actually really good at covering a lot of ground. They weren't necessarily pressing, but when the ball actually went out wide or went to a center back, that's when they were actually doing a really good job to cut off any kind of passing lanes that they would have usually liked to play through the middle. So I think that's worth kind of saying as well. Uh,
Yeah, I agree. That's well said.
and I guess we've kind of said enough about City. Let's get a little bit into Man United and Brentford. They get the early goal with Jensen. It is another Onana spill, and then McTominay comes on. I guess I don't know in the 85th minute and gets 2 goals. He does basically what Scotland's McTominay sometimes does. And it's kind of funny because there've been a couple games when he's played. I think he actually played versus Brighton where I was like he makes them significantly worse. But that was in the kind of a diamond shape, and it feels like he's never really had a position necessarily for him. It feels like he is maybe more of an advanced kind of midfielder than necessarily someone deeper. But you finally saw you saw him come on and basically immediately what was being into the box, and it seemed like it coincided with Brentford not being able to necessarily found an outlet to just kind of relieve pressure. It felt like for the final 20 minutes, Brentford were just kind of playing in their own end, and so
Mhm.
bringing in another player to be in the box, someone that's good in the air, that was a good call, I think, by Ten Hag. And really, I guess a story in this game also was both keepers having spills. Um, Onana for the goal, but also Strakosha. And I think we saw a little bit why maybe he's the backup. Um,
Yes, yes, yes. I agree. Yeah, that. I don't know where to start with this one, Ben, but yeah, it was obviously heartbreaking. These are the type of games that Brentford have sort of the opposite philosophy as a lot of teams in the bottom, where they sort of surrender against the big foes and don't expect to pick up points there. Brentford, in some ways, struggle with the relegation teams and do really well against the top six.
yeah,
So you're kind of almost hoping for points here, just because these are going to add up at the end of the season to that total to hopefully keep them staying up, which they should, but we can come on to that. But yeah, I think yeah, Strakosha. Let's just start there. I think yeah, you definitely see why he's the backup. It's funny because when they signed him the previous summer, very tall keeper, has a lot of confidence, played really well Italian league. He did seem like a player that was potentially going to maybe challenge Rhea, and
interesting.
this was just at least maybe start playing some competitions. I think there was a thought that maybe Rhea was going to go last season. Maybe Strakosha was going to maybe eventually find his way into the first team, just one way or another, and it just never worked out. He had some injuries as well. But anyway, this game at large, I think, was just heartbreaking because I think that this is Brentford playing a shape that they do really well in. This
Yeah,
is a couple of amazing performances by their center backs, which to me
Pinnock
is sometimes
Pinnock was
headache.
amazing. I feel like the
Yeah,
only the only header he lost was unfortunately the one at the end. It almost seemed like he won maybe 10 out of 11 headers in this game.
and Chris Breyer, I think that he's kind of the forgotten center back at Brentford. He's a Rolls Royce player in terms of his physical abilities, in terms of the way he can carry the ball. He's a 6'5", 6'6" player that can basically play as a fullback. And you had Marcus Rashford subbed in this game
Tied
and
up. Yeah.
basically getting cheers from the fans when Garnacho came on, just because of the fact that he couldn't get the better of Iron. But the thing I want to say about I guess maybe Brentford is and before we go too much maybe into the United performance is I think they're going to be fine. You look at the XG numbers, the standings, the fact that the Brentford are pretty much performing as is last season, even without Ivan Toney. What is concerning to me about this team though is they're really not integrating a lot of new players. They're trying a shape that they basically Thomas Frank discovered in the second half of the COVID season, and that ultimately got them promotion. It's this very defensive, counterattacking 3-5-2. There's definitely some wrinkles in there where they press teams really well, and it can be very exciting, like it was in the first half. But it relies on a lot of concentration. It relies on a lot of team familiarity, and it makes it really hard for Brentford to really play any kind of cohesive attacking style, especially for players like Lewis Potter, Milwaukee coming back in just doesn't make a lot of sense in this lineup. Not even get down to some of the young midfielders, and it does worry me a little bit. I'm not saying Brentford's going to go down. I probably cry wolf a little bit every season that they're going to be in trouble, and then they go on these remarkable runs. Last season it was around this time, and then the year before it was when Christian Eriksen came in. But I do slightly worry for this team a little more. I do think that there's a little wobbly, and it does feel a little bit like the first season, the first Premier League season, 2020, 21, where had it not really been for that kind of boost they got from Christian Eriksen,
yeah.
Brentford were in a pretty rough spot. They had lost a 3-0 game to Liverpool. They had lost a couple games to they tied Palace. They actually really beat Everton in a game that they shouldn't have won that season, and that kind of turned their.
Is that the red card?
That kind of the red card, and that's the game where Everton hit the post multiple times. It was actually based that Everton won. I mean, that Brentford won, and I think people kind of forget that Brentford were really kind of a sliding doors moment of being in trouble that season. So this league is unforgiving. Now we're in a pretty lucky season where I think the relegation clubs the promotion clubs are really bad.
Yeah, I think that's the main thing.
But I do think that if Burnley figure it out, and we think Everton is pretty good, you're really looking at kind of Bournemouth here, kind of cutting adrift.
Bournemouth, and maybe Forest. Forest. Actually.
Yeah,
maybe Forest.
But I'm saying discount the promotion teams. If one of those teams performs, let's say it's Burnley, then you're really looking just at Bournemouth and maybe a handful of Wolves and Forest, but Brentford might be in that pack. So this is a type of game where I really think that Brentford could use the 3 points, because them sitting at 10 would have been a lot different than them sitting at 3 points off relegation at 7.
Yeah. I mean, just it's very interesting because he Thomas Frank has gone back and forth between you mentioned the 3-5-2 and sometimes the 4-3-3 that we're seeing. But I don't necessarily know if they necessarily have the midfield to do that, and it feels like it seems like I don't necessarily know if they also have the center backs to necessarily play that way, because another thing too is missing Rico Henry, that injury, and you mentioned how important he was in a lot of their build-up play, not just kind of defense, not just defensively, but also not even just build-up play, also almost like a wing option, almost like an attacking option.
Yes,
I remember him really kind of the announcers just kept saying his name for a lot of their best moments for Bournemouth in a game that they probably should have won. They ended up kind of tying that. But that was kind of the one time when I was like, Rico Henry gets a lot more forward than I realized. And I actually ended up getting him for fantasy, and then that maybe you can blame me for the jinx. And then that kind of happened for Newcastle. It's just one thing that's always kind of been a theme with them is open play. They don't necessarily create a whole lot of chances open play. I guess in defense they're okay. Maybe the kind of the positive you can look at is missing Ben Mee. I feel like Ben Mee's maybe a better player than Nathan Collins. Collins is kind of struggling a little bit, at least on the ball.
Especially on the winning goal. Collins beat it for the header there. You think Mee probably can maybe defend that one better.
And maybe with Flecken, have some issues a little bit, maybe with diving, but maybe he'd. I mean, the thing that really showed up with Strakosha, now that I look at all these chances from Man United, is I have him parrying the ball almost every save. He was making saves, but he was always parrying it. And I think for the goal, you finally saw at least was it for the offsides one? There was like a Fernandez half shot from like a free kick. The free kick was really poor from Onyeka. I didn't think he had necessarily had a good half when he came on. So maybe their depth in midfield isn't necessarily great either. But yeah, it was just kind of a free kick that Fernandez just had a shot. Maybe it's going towards the post, but it was a weird parry, and then Fernandez was able to get to that parry, and that he sent the ball in, and that's when it kind of deflected off. Maybe off Pinnock or off Ayer. It was offside because of the Martial moment, but that was like you kept getting warning signs, and I feel like maybe you have Flecken, maybe that doesn't necessarily happen, so that can maybe be moved away. But just the possession, they're not necessarily able to keep the ball. I think the main thing that I liked especially with Ayer being back, is you saw them actually be able to somewhat keep the ball a little bit, just play through United a little bit, and I think one thing you kind of texted me was everything changed when Weiser went off, and they just didn't have an outlet to go over the top to go long because it seemed like
100%.
Malpai wasn't able to do that. Malpai maybe can offer you something a little different. Maybe when you're in the final third, you have more of the ball, and he can be kind of an option in the box. But he wasn't able. He wasn't an outlet to go long and hold on to the ball. Um, so and Malpai and Bremer had been running the entire game. Maybe his legs were kind of shot as well. So I feel like you kind of missed that. You miss maybe having someone like Kevin Shada would have helped in this game. Brentford have a lot of injuries. I guess it's worth kind of saying that
100%.
as well. And some of these injuries aren't necessarily long term. So you're going to get most of those players back. You imagine. I think Josh Silva might be another. So that can maybe be the optimistic side. And then the other note I had was you kind of touched on it as well. It's just you look at Luton Town, you look at Sheffield. It just feels the promoted sides are maybe as bad as maybe they've been. I guess since I've necessarily been following them. I remember like Derby County. I guess like 7 points. I guess one or like 11 points one season. Derby County is probably going to be worse than them, but it doesn't feel like they're going to necessarily be up there. And the only thing I can think of is like the way Luton Town are so physical and tall. That maybe head to head wouldn't necessarily be a great match for Brentford, but at least points wise over the season, I think you guys would be able to manage them. And
Well, one thing, Ben, I'll say is this happened. Preferably Burnley after the national break, so obviously maybe a 6-pointer game in some sense there. But they then play Chelsea, West Ham, Liverpool, Arsenal, and Brighton, kind of in a quick span. Where you think for most teams it's actually a pretty rough fixture list there. But
it forces you to play that 3-5-2. It forces you to be a more defensive counter. Yeah.
So I think that with all these injuries, they can't play that really attacking, expansive style that I think they probably ultimately need to do, just because they need to achieve some level of growth and integrate all these new players that they've had, who are starting to turn out like not very good signings. But this is a part of the season. If they play that defensive style, they're not going to they're going to probably 8 times out of 10 in a game that they're up 1-0 win that contest.
Well, that happened last year. From what I remember, when Brentford went on that crazy run from like December through February, where like they just straight did not lose a game. They like what 15, 20. They weren't 20 games unbeaten, but they went on like a crazy stretch, and it was during when they played everyone in the top 6 essentially. Um, so I think that kind of goes to that theory. I was just wondering, could there be a way where you could still play 3 at the back, but also play with 3 attackers, kind of like that 3-4-3 kind of formation? But this probably isn't the time to experiment. I mean, one thing I wanted to get with you is basically the way the Man United get their first goal. This kind of showed up to me, and it was Garnacho getting the ball and basically trying as hard as he could to get to the byline and then doing a cutback. And I just feel like it's very weird how there were a lot of goals actually this week where this happened. The goal that Spurs won with James Maddison kind of did it. Last week, Pedro Neto was able to get to the byline and sent in a cross, and that was how Wolves got their own goal. And it just feels it's very weird how teams don't seem to understand like that's actually a good area to get at. And I don't know. Everyone keeps trying to play these inverted players where you're playing a guy with like the opposite foot where they don't like going that way. And it just feels like this is a decent way to actually open up a game and create a chance. And I feel like it was fitting that chance actually came from that, and it was something that Rashford wasn't necessarily doing. And then on the other side, when they were playing Bruno or Mason Mount or whoever on the right side, no, they basically United didn't have any width or anything on the opposite side, and you finally saw the goal come from someone actually doing that. I just feel like that was eye opening to me.
Yeah, it was a funny performance because it feels like the kind of game that it really isn't won with anything that Ten Hag did in terms of this is a game that Ole Gunnar Solskjaer probably does pretty well with. Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting about United where they, McTominay is I think he's one of the leading scorers in the European qualifying. I think he might be either top of the charts with Lukaku or right near it.
Yeah, for Scotland.
For Scotland, yeah.
I'm not surprised about that. Yeah, I think you're right.
But he's a really interesting player that you would have thought that this would, I guess Brentford is good at set pieces and wouldn't be a player that would actually transform it. But the only thing I'll say about United's performance is I'm really concerned about Casemiro this season.
Yeah.
I I am starting to think that Real Madrid probably had a good sense of maybe where this player was heading, and Real Madrid is a club that doesn't really comfortably let go of their players. They're also very good at timing when to let go of them, and so. And now, granted, they had Trumeni, they had Camavinga, they have Toni Kroos there. They have a lot of midfield depth, but they I'm starting to see not only is Ten Hag's tactics letting down Casemiro, he's starting to look a little bit leggy to me, and he's starting to also not let the good at passing anymore. And
Yeah, well, yeah,
I
because the goal comes the goal that Brentford scored on was basically Casemiro having a bad pass, or someone I guess it was in Bremer. He had read it. He read that he was trying to get the ball to Amrabat, and Bremer was able to get the turnover. And then on the other end, I guess Lindelof had like a bad clearance, and then the bounce ended up kind of falling. It like bounced off Casemiro, so that wasn't really fair for him. But
you know I
I think you're
wonder
100% right on that.
yeah, and I wonder going back to when Ten Hag first got there. You look at this team, and again, unfortunately, there's tons of injuries. It's probably some scrutiny that needs to be had on maybe some of the training methods. Obviously, Ten Hag's known to be a very draconian trainer. Obviously, every time they lose a very high profile game, the class of '92 gets on, yells at them. Ten Hag makes them run sprints for the following morning, and everybody's happy then. But I look back to when Ten Hag first got there, and he opened up his Ajax phone book, and he really wanted Frankie De Jong, and I keep thinking that that's kind of the player they're missing right now.
100%.
Is
Yeah.
is somebody kind of deeper in midfield that can progress the ball really quickly. Obviously, Frankie De Jong, very athletic player who can break up play, but that's kind of the zone that I'm most worried about United. I'm not worried about Onana. I think there are clear flaws there, but I think there are clear advantages over De Gea. I think people are quick to forget that
So I think right.
David De Gea had a lot of mistakes last season.
I think you
That
and me are on the kind of the same page to kind of cut in. Is like they were two things can be true at the same time. Where it was time to move off De Gea, and maybe the mistake
yes,
was bringing in Onana. And the thing that keeps coming back in my mind is why did they target Onana? It wasn't. I don't think it was because he was really good for Inter Milan, really good in the Champions League final. I remember both of us were praising him in the Champions League final. It's because it's his former player. And it feels like he's very
well,
comfortable looking for his former players. I was the thing that blew my mind was when I was like, "Oh, they signed Amrabat. This is pretty clever, and it's finally not a former player of his." And no, he was coaching them at was it Utrecht? He was coaching
yeah,
at some
I
like
actually I actually didn't know that.
Belgium club.
Well, you know what this comes down to? You're seeing the same instance at Bayern Munich where Thomas Tuchel got a lot of power, and when you have these managers who clearly want certain types of players, they want their own players. Um, it becomes really easy for clubs to fleece them for really expensive fees. I'm thinking about Anthony the previous season before, where
Yeah.
where United played about $100 million, and eventually it really catches up to you because the Anthony purchase. Just to quickly go tangent to that, United, if you remember that summer, had already spent a lot of funds on other various signings that Ten Hag wanted, and there was obviously a lot of outgoings, obviously the Cristiano Ronaldo saga too, but
Mhm.
they basically had to dip into their transfer kitty the following summer. So that's one of the reasons why you didn't see such a robust purchase this summer for other needs that they had, is they actually had spent a lot of some on Anthony, according to reporting. So I. And I think that kind of single-minded pursuit is something that's kind of indicative of a club that and other clubs that realize that United just simply want one kind of player, and that's somebody that played alongside Ten Hag.
Well, they've spent
So
Right, they
yeah,
spent
go
like
ahead.
they've spent like 400 million. I think under Ten Hag, and you look at because Jaden Sancho, I think was maybe what 80 or so million. He hasn't worked out. Anthony is kind of for the same reason, though he also has legal trouble now, and that's the reason why he hasn't been able to play for the last couple of games. And maybe he's been cleared of those investigations, but even when he was playing, he's kind of a one trick pony a little bit as well. Yeah, I mentioned how the goal that Garnacho scored. Anthony's never going to score that because he doesn't have a right foot. And I feel like they've kind of struggled a little bit with that. They've never really had anyone to play with Rashford on, like on the opposite side. It's always been kind of imbalanced. Um, and it just the way that how much money that they've spent, it has been crazy. And you look at how Mason Mount. I don't necessarily know if you could have done this because they have Bruno. I mean, yeah, they have Bruno Fernandez, but it's just crazy how to look at how Mason Mount is doing for say James Madison, and both were available. Or maybe that isn't the best comparison because you'd have the same issue where you wouldn't be able to necessarily play each other. But it's just very funny how they targeted Mason Mount for some very odd reason, and the issues that Chelsea was having last season, I think they're having Man United's now having them with Mason Mount. They don't know where to play him. Mason Mount's
Oh,
probably
100%.
probably like a front player, not necessarily like a front like an attacking midfielder essentially that likes to play on the left side. Uh, eh, in the front line, they when they play a 4-2-3-1, that's Rashford, and you can't you can't necessarily do that. And it seems Mason Mount is basically having to learn a different position when he's playing I guess in a pivot kind of role, and that hasn't necessarily worked out. And you saw in this game, it seemed like he played in three different positions, and neither. I think he started in the central area, and then Bruno was like, "I kind of want to play there," and moved Mason Mount to the right, and that didn't work out either. And I don't think he's maybe created one chance since he's joined for them, and that's been a very interesting signing as well because they paid a lot of money for him.
Yeah, it's
Like the one
yeah,
The one signing I think that has worked out somewhat, um, has
it's
been
Hoyland.
Lisandro Martinez,
Well,
but
I
and
was saying, Hoyland's looked
oh,
promising
Hoyland,
so
absolutely, yeah.
yeah,
It feels like, especially in the Champions League games, that yeah,
yeah, yeah.
that probably is the better answer, but I feel like Martinez has been, pretty good, and it feels like sometimes if Ten Hag wants to find a way to kind of do what maybe, Klopp's doing with Trent, where he's almost like playing him in central defense. I don't know if you kind of you noticed this, for Brighton, but Trent sometimes isn't necessarily playing, at fullback. Sometimes, yeah, they're lining in a back four, but sometimes he's kind of in the central part where he's, like, pushing Matip out wide. And that's allowing him less space to go
Yeah.
from defense to midfield. I wonder if you could do that with Martinez. Maybe that actually is what they were doing, and Martinez can kind of be in midfield and kind of be a little bit more of that pivot player, to maybe be next to Casemiro or Amrabat. So I feel like they are missing him. But it is very strange how I never looked at Man United as a team that I thought was going to be a top four contender, even though they finished in front of Liverpool last season. Uh, it- Whether it was
Good for you.
who they got
Yeah.
in, it's just very strange how this. We mentioned how maybe a team that surprised. This isn't that surprising that they're a little bit struggling, and it's funny how they kinda did a little bit with this with Ollie. They had that little purple patch, season with him where they
Yeah.
think they finished second. They weren't really close to getting a title, but they finished second. They won a title last season with Den Haag, and I think he did a good job to move away from Harry Maguire, move away from, Cristiano Ronaldo, even though, that said, Harry Maguire had to start this game. The not having they've had one game where they started Harry Maguire and Johnny Evans. It
Yeah.
it the So I don't necessarily think it is on Ten Hag. When you see multiple managers suffering the same thing, I think it's more, of the board or more of the people in front, and they've had an issue all season or all year where you didn't know who the owners were going to be, if they were going to sell or not. I don't know if that was a head fake to, like, boost their stock options, but it feels like, that cloud over their ownership has, I think, affected the whole club, to be honest, and affected the players. I think that's maybe been a little bit of a hidden storyline.
I got to run out of here in a few minutes, Ben. But do you want to quickly cover Brighton and Liverpool? Because that was probably the game I enjoyed the most this weekend.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think what's funny about this is, I it almost seemed like both teams set up to do the same thing that Arsenal and City were doing. Both team, but like everything started when the keepers had the ball, and you actually saw that for three of the goals. Three of the goals came from mistakes. But it was just both teams also it's different because both teams had a way both teams were fine, like, the note I had was both teams were committing numbers high. So there
Yeah.
was space, behind for teams to enjoy. But both teams also had a way to play through the middle and out wide. It feels like when City were going out wide, they were doing it to open up the middle, and I feel like Arsenal understood that. In this game, both Brighton and, Liverpool had a way to, because Matoma, have a way, and a Dingra in this game. It was interesting to see Sully Marsh played a fullback. I wasn't expecting
It's
that.
amazing.
And, he draws the foul to actually for the goal that led, for this second goal for them. So that was cheeky by Deserby, damn him. But both teams had uh, when they would go out wide, it wasn't necessarily to just kind of open up the middle. It was actually if their space was there, actually take it. Both teams had an ability to attack both ways, and I feel like that's maybe the reason why you enjoyed this, and I enjoyed it. Well, to an extent, I didn't enjoy them drawing. I mean, both teams only having 14 shots and not necessarily a lot on target, but it was just neither team really was comfortable. You didn't really see when someone had the ball where teams weren't necessarily running. The ball was constantly moving, and both teams were constantly running to try to chase it, try to win it back.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think I go back to the fact that the fullbacks, which I think are becoming just where the fullbacks end up playing, I think it's ultimately deciding how a game plays out. So if
Yep.
Brighton, typically what they'll do is they'll really push their fullbacks up against the touchline. They'll bunch their center backs together, and that will be the sort of early shape in the build up. And that was honestly their undoing. The first goal that Liverpool scores is a turnover from the center backs to the midfield.
Yeah, it was dumb.
And Solly Marsh, who probably should be marking Mohamed Salah, even if they are in a deep block, let alone here. So Mohamed Salah, takes advantage of that space really well, and a great turn by Luis Diaz.
Well, it was not just Salah. Elliot was there. Elliot actually just let him. So you had two players that were completely unmarked there, and I think you're right.
Yeah.
It was because Solly Marsh was too high up. His positioning kind of screwed him.
But you're not going to see that. You're not going to see that against Arsenal City. You're not going to see that kind of advancement from Ake from Zinchenko or Ben White on the other side. You're just not going to see that kind of risk taking in the early build up stage.
because you just can't lose the ball. That right. Mm-hmm.
You just can't lose the ball right there. And I think that's what made this game so breathless at times. And the other thing I'll add here is that I haven't watched a lot of Liverpool this season, unfortunately. But I was really impressed by Szoboszlai.
Yeah,
Szoboszlai. I was obviously you were very high on him coming into this season, but we all expect a level of adjustment, especially under a Klopp system that's complicated and has lots of moving parts and a team that was actually really crying out for midfield help. But you would think that it does require a lot of work rate. But he's just been stellar. I thought his energy, his movement. I think also he's kind of a quietly intelligent player. The way that he attacks space.
Yeah.
He'll take up a lot of different positions in the game that I think that Jordan Henderson did do a good job of doing. Maybe just you can maybe touch on that as well. And the other thing is McAllister in that deep role was very problematic early in the game. But I did think that he did kind of find his sea legs a little bit in the second half.
I agree with that. Yeah.
What he started to really tick, I think Liverpool actually there was a period of this game where I think Liverpool could have ran away with it, and I think it was to Brighton's credit that they kind of pulled themselves back, because I think if you play that second half out again, Liverpool maybe went around 3-4-1, and it's kind of actually a little bit of a missed opportunity from Liverpool there, because I think Brighton were for the taking, especially with the Gravenberch's performance. I think Gravenberch was really well when he came on too.
You mentioned Szoboszlai. He basically set up Gravenberch, and I think what happened was the ball kind of took a weird bounce right before it got to him, and maybe it's on his weak foot. I don't really know what his foot is, and he got contact and it just kind of hit the bar. It's an open goal, and that goes in. Liverpool probably do win this. I feel like their performances for the last two games, including Spurs, they should have gotten more than 1 point. But you mentioned McAllister, and I feel like if there is a reason why I'm not necessarily as high on them as others, is I do feel like that still is a vulnerability. Robertson
100%
can sometimes Klopp has basically been kind of shifting between different formations, and things change. It almost seems like there's not really a set formation anymore. Things change in certain game situations, but sometimes Robinson, either as a center back or in this case as a fullback, he allowed. There were a couple times when Alisson had to bail him out. There was one time when Adenga was played through, I think, by Ferguson, and Robinson was completely caught sleeping, and it forced an amazing save by Alisson. And it sucks because I praised Robinson last week for his defending even though the goal ended up coming on his side versus Spurs. I thought he was amazing versus Kulishevsky. But the thing that's really showed up is the way that Klopp's been using Trent is completely. I can't remember this from a different.
It's so odd.
Any kind of player.
Yeah.
And it used to be I used to be concerned about it because I was like, "You're asking him to do way too much." Last season, he really did have to do everything because, you looked at who the midfield was, and that's basically by him playing him in kind of in midfield slash, I guess, inverted fullback, whatever the terminology is, that it is what basically saved their season. But also during those games, so the creation went up and the goals went up, but also they forced Allison to make a lot of saves. But they haven't lost yet. Well, I guess the Spurs one. But before that Spurs one, they had gone unbeaten all the way back to like mid-April, and it had been kind of Trent being played there. And really, the big difference this season than last is the midfield isn't just kind of technical, or isn't just like a workhorse. And they have a technical side that I can't remember Klopp's teams having. And you mentioned Sloboshai. What's crazy about him is, in that Newcastle game when they were forced to kind of do, switch to basically a 4-4-1 kind of double pivot, they played him and Elliott kind of finish that game. And it's just like technical workhorses that were also comfortable kind of playing centrally, kind of because playing in that central area, it's entirely different. The way you turn, you have less time. You can't lose the ball. So you have to think about that as well. And both were able to do it. It almost feels like Klopp's found a way to just kind of improve the technical side without losing the work rate, and that hasn't. I can't imagine that was easy to recruit. And Sloboshai is a player that I was expecting him to kind of be a little bit like Kevin De Bruyne, and
Yeah.
we saw that for he had a wicked goal versus it might have been Leicester, versus
Yeah.
not,
In the cup.
or
Yeah. In
versus
the cup game. That was amazing.
uh,
It's Leicester.
Okay, yeah. Just completely took the net almost completely off. So I knew he had that kind of in his locker. I knew he was a creator. But just the way the work rate has been absolutely amazing, and it seems like you can play him anywhere. You can also play him not just in midfield. You can play him maybe as an attacker.
Yes.
So just it almost seems like he's been. Everyone was going to go look at Madison. I think he's been signing at least for Liverpool of the summer, and this team.
Comment, Ben, but quick comment here, Ben. I was going to mention is this is also a game. I think Liverpool probably win if they have Jota and
Yeah, well, it's interesting because just kind of cut in. Uh, a lot of Liverpool fans have started to get a little bit on Luis Diaz, not necessarily Darwin Núñez. I guess Liverpool fans seem to like kind of go at someone every single game week. Uh,
they always have they have their hated player. Yeah.
this week, well, it used to be. Well, mine was Milner every single game week, but I feel like I was justified with that. They used to go at Genie, but it has seemed to be like Luis Diaz, even though Luis Diaz had like he scored that goal for Spurs and was unlucky to have that ruled out. He had that chance. He had that moment in the second half where he kind of hit one over the bar. Maybe he could have got it on goal from maybe 8 yards out. But I feel like Jota would have been someone. I think you're right. Maybe takes a little bit more. Maybe takes a chance better than that. And it feels like when Jota plays, he- he'll make Liverpool fans go crazy throughout the entire game. If you like follow Liverpool account, he'll probably be complaining about Jota the entire game, and then Jota will score at the very end. You'll be like, "What the hell? I love him." He just
Yeah.
has that knack to just kind of be in the area, and when he gets a chance, he takes it. He might
Yeah.
he might lose the ball a lot. He's not really the best passer. Sometimes his dribbling, he doesn't necessarily seem the most athletic, but he's just cheeky. I think you're right about that. Klopp being able to maybe bring him on, maybe they would have been able to get something out instead.
A quick word, Ben, on Brighton. I do think we were talking at the beginning of the segment, and I got to go in a second, but that they did look they were flying out of the gates when the season started. It looked like they weren't going to miss Caicedo, and then it looked like both the fact they had a cup competition, they also seemed to not be able to figure out. It started to basically show up that they were missing Caicedo. They looked a little bit light in midfield there.
100%. Yeah.
Gilmore and Gross. Gross has just got a lot of miles put on him, and also I think that there's some games that in big games last season, Gross played out wide and wide right. Basically, was able to tuck in, sort of like
He was a fullback in some games.
like they could basically do this sort of the Zinchenko thing where he could tuck inside, and they could basically do that, and they can't do that when they have Gross in midfield. But they're quietly. I mean, this Baleba guy had an incredible performance. And
He was.
He's a player. He's a player for the French league that I know a lot of people were really excited about. A lot of the analytics people. And if you start to look at Brighton's midfield going forward, they got Dahoud there, obviously carrying a little bit of a knock. Gilmore has been a revelation in terms of what his promise started out at, and then looked like his career was going on another trajectory. when he's loaned out to Norwich. But they do have a really they do have a fun little base there at midfield with a little bit of rotation. I think can serve them pretty well. So if this Baleba thing turns out being maybe half of what Caicedo does, then I think Brighton will be in pretty good position going forward. And not to mention they got another star on their hands with Adingra. So
Yeah,
just a really fun, promising performance from Brighton.
I actually made it kind of a joke when after the Casado thing happened. I was like, find out who Brighton is targeting, and Liverpool should get him. And then when it was Carlos Balbo, I was like, they should sign him. And especially the way you're right, he had an incredible cameo performance. I look at Brighton. I think the kind of the main thing showing up in some of these games is he De Zerbi wants to play a certain way, and maybe he doesn't necessarily have the center backs to do that. Now, maybe
Yeah,
with Balba, he can get away with that. But some of those games when Ferguson's had to play, Ferguson and Dunk kind of don't necessarily have the best feet. It's
yeah,
very weird how it seems you don't really know week to week which keeper's going to play. Sometimes it's for Bregan, sometimes it's Jason Steele. So that's kind of been a little bit of a surprise. And two, it feels like he doesn't necessarily know what to do with his forward lineup. It seems like all these games has forced him to kind of change up the rotations a little bit. And Ferguson and Welbeck or Ferguson and Pedro haven't necessarily uh, got it going. And Sully Marsh, I thought before this, Sully Marsh in the game last week versus Villa, and the game in the Europa game, because I actually did watch their Europa game versus Marseille. I thought he was poor as well. It was interesting to actually see because he's been their right wing
yeah.
attacker. In this game, he was their left back, and he was incredible. So I've been a bit of a surprise about that. So I feel like with Brighton, it's going to be more of a case of does that Europa do those roster changes end up just kind of changing a little bit change a little bit of their momentum essentially. But you're right. If they can get that midfield fixed, things do because especially with that DM spot, because what that does is that gives you protection in front of those center backs. Um, so
Yeah, one thing I am curious to see is and this will be my last comment, but I got to run. But
yeah.
I do think that teams are starting to figure out the Zerbi. We didn't see it so much in this game. I think in some ways Klopp played into his hands, some ways he didn't.
Well,
But I do.
yeah, well,
Oh, go ahead.
I thought it was very interesting. It was entirely different than Arsenal and City in one respect, where Darwin Núñez immediately was putting pressure on the keeper. He didn't care. Liverpool did not
Yeah,
care when Dunk and it might have been Webster or it was Hugo Julio. They didn't care when they had the ball. They were like, "That's fine. You guys can beat us with that." They were pressing the keeper for Bregan, and
for Brighton.
they were
Yeah,
making sure that the fullbacks and I guess Matoma and whatnot were covered. But they didn't care when the two center backs had the ball. I'm wondering if other teams can kind of copy that.
I think that's and I think that's what I saw a little bit actually in their first game against AEK in the Europa League. Because I saw a little bit of that. I also saw that they if you think about the way that they actually set up, they have a pretty high risk setup in terms of the fact they basically they play two forwards. They actually play four forwards, but they push Matoma and Adingra really wide, really wide and really high. They drop Ferguson and João Pedro
Yep,
deep, but essentially they're playing without a third central midfielder. And I'll be curious
100%.
to see it. I'll be curious to see if in any iteration of this team, if he does ever kind of evolve, sort of like the same way Klopp did, where he eventually says, "I need another midfielder in there." Maybe those quick combinations that the Zerbi sort of combination from center back to the midfielder to the other midfielder. If he sort of needs another ball pass in there as well, just to shore things up. Because the one thing I'll say about the Zerbi is all of his games are exciting because they score goals, but they're also one of the highest teams conceding in the league as well.
Yeah,
So,
fourth worst in the league, 16 goals.
but again, I still think not that there's not that you're buying low on him, but I still think that they're going to figure it out just because you look at the turnover they had this summer, the new signings. You mentioned Igor, Julio, Baleba, Adingra. They're eventually just going to start cooking and they're going to crush some teams lower than them in the league.
Oh,
So
absolutely.
anyway, I got to run then. But
All
it
right,
was a
bud.
pleasure joining you. Take care.
And I guess actually that's probably a good way to kind of end. So we'll just kind of do those three, and then I'll do it like a different video for the others. But anyways, thank you for joining us. Thank you, Jeremy, for joining. That was a lot of fun. It's good to well, we got to talk a little bit about Liverpool. I wasn't really expecting that. Always good to do that. And some of the insights he offered with Brentford were excellent as well. So want to thank him for that again. And that'll be it. So I'll try to do like I said a different video for I guess like the other games. But until then, you stay squatty and stop recording.